This tank chat's going to be about the Armata, the T-14 Russian tank. What is it about the Armata that causes so much fuss and attention? So much time and energy at this particular moment seems to be focused on it, and also a lot of ridicule.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members, and our Super Thanks donors. Please join them if you can, and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
So what do we know about the T-14 Armata tank? Now, for obvious reasons, we don't have an Armata here at the Tank Museum. So the information I'm going to be giving you is culled from many sources, and some of those may just be propaganda. One of the main reasons why the T-14 Armata has drawn such attention is not just because it's the latest in a long line of tanks from the major tank-producing nation of all time, but it's such a radical departure from a well-established previous design philosophy. This is the first tank produced by Russia in the post-Soviet era. So it's worth looking at what that design philosophy the Soviets had. From back in the Second World War, Soviet tank design showed an evolutionary process. During the war, the more radical T-44 tank was built, but a decision was made to upgrade the T-34 with a new turret and 85mm gun, rather than mass-produce this brand new T-44 design. One feature of Soviet post-war tank design is obvious to all who have an interest in tanks: the amazing and very confusing continuity of shape and size. The vast majority of post-war tanks up to the T-14 were of a very similar profile and had a weight of around 35 to just over 40 tons. In balancing the traditional triangle of design features, firepower, protection and mobility, Soviet design opted for firepower as the priority. For many years, Soviet tanks had guns in advance of NATO in caliber and range, if not in sighting and fire control systems. Soviet tanks had the first guns stabilised in two planes, infrared sights and searchlights, the first smoothbore gun, and they were the first to field armour-piercing, fin-stabilised discarding sabot rounds. They fitted an autoloader into the T-64 and into all their subsequent tanks. In a number of these areas, NATO was either following in the Soviets' wake, but when NATO did produce those items, their technology seems to be superior or an equivalent and built to a better standard. Firepower on Soviet tanks rose from 100mm guns on the T-54 to 115mm smoothbore on the T-62. The single-piece rounds were about a metre long and heavy, making them difficult to store and manoeuvre in the tank. With the T-64, then the T-72 and subsequent tanks, an autoloader solved this issue. With an autoloader, 20 to 25 rounds could be fired at about 8 rounds a minute. In comparison, a manually loaded Centurion could get a dozen rounds off in a minute, and an S-tank, with its fixed single-piece ammunition, 15 rounds in a minute. Two-part ammunition also took the crew much longer to restow. With the T-64, a bigger 125mm smoothbore gun was fitted and more frontal armour for around the same mass. In the 1980s, that meant the Soviets had 100, 115 and 125mm guns all in service at the same time, and that surely would be a real problem for the logistics system. But actually, the Soviet military, they accept this. They don't go for what NATO tended to do, which was to upgrade older model tanks when a new gun comes along. Having a tank hard to see and destroy was next on the Soviet list. Soviet tanks remained of a low profile and were much smaller than their Western equivalents. They had well-designed ballistic-shaped turrets and heavily protected frontal arcs. By transversely mounting the diesel engine across the back of the T-54, the hull length could be shortened. So the Soviets aimed to keep the volume of space that was going to be protected by the armour as small as possible. And of course that in turn is going to affect the crew. Third on the Soviet design list was mobility. but Soviet tanks matched Western tanks in the power-to-weight ratio in the early years of the Cold War. Development of the wartime V12 diesel engine continued from World War II vintage. A supercharged version was put in the T-72, and that gave about 780 horsepower, but it was considered underpowered. One area of design in the Soviet era that can appear at odds with the presentation of a monolithic, centrally controlled Soviet system is the apparent rivalry and political favoritism that led to the building of certain tank designs. Morozov, the designer of the T-54, also designed the more expensive and complex T-64 as a rival to the Nizhny Tagil factory offering the T-62 tank. Despite looking like a continuation of Soviet tank design in shape and size, the complexity and troubled operating history of the T-64 led factory staff having to follow tank units around to ensure the vehicles could be kept operational. And despite Morozov's protests, ultimately the simpler and 40% cheaper T-72 tank designed by his rivals was put into production. The T-72 was initially only to be produced if needed in a wartime situation. One area that Western analysts often criticise Soviet tank design was in ergonomics, or the ability of the crew to be able to use that space. The very small space given in which crew members had to operate may have been mitigated by an insistence crews were around 5'1" to 5'3" inches high. Noise levels, very high noise levels, vibration, stress, and the physical effort required to drive these tanks meant it was exhausting for crew members over longer periods. Aggressive track, wide with no rubber pads, were fitted onto all Soviet tanks to cope with the Russian landscape and the dreaded Rasputitsa, when roads become muddy morasses. On most tanks, dozer blades were fitted to help tanks dig in open country, and they also made sure copious smoke production was allowable and fitted with smoke dischargers on pretty much all vehicles, as the Second World War experience had taught the Soviets hiding your vehicles for as long as possible was important. For river crossings, Soviet vehicles were expected to swim or snorkel. Snorkels were fitted on most tanks to allow them to cross rivers to a depth of about 5 meters. And because of the use of a mass conscript army containing many ethnic groups and languages, this also had an influence on the need for simplicity in operation, training, and maintenance of Soviet tanks. The T-80 tank was a development of the T-64, and it was the first production tank to have as its main engine a gas turbine. The T-80 was accepted into service in 1979 and produced at the Omsk factory in Russia, but because of its shorter range and incredibly thirsty engine, a diesel engine version was swiftly introduced. The T-80 continued to be developed in Ukraine after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The next Soviet tank, the T-90, had its origins in a program aimed at developing a single replacement for the earlier T-64, T-72 and T-80 tanks. The T-72 platform was selected as a basis for the new generation of tanks, owing to its cost-effectiveness and simplicity and automotive qualities. The T-90 uses a gun and the sights from the T-80U, a new engine, and importantly, thermal sights. The T-90, with its much more sophisticated kit, went into low-level production in 1993, and it sports an upgrade to pretty much all the systems on the T-72, including its main gun. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, that brought many tank programs that were being developed in Russia to an end, and the only market that really kept some of those tank industries going was through export. The rise to power of Putin in the early 2000s saw him attempt to rearm the Russian army and give it again a sense of power and pride. He placed more money into its military and defense industries, and in 2008 there was a major full-scale Russian military reform, and that began to modernize the Russian armed forces. In part of re-equipping the army, Western weapons and technology was bought. This had included the Iveco Lynx vehicles, and Britain was buying these just about the same time and calling them Panther. The Armata series of tracked vehicles is in many ways part of this redevelopment programme. The idea was to develop a family or universal combat platform. This family was to include a T-15 infantry fighting vehicle, a combat engineer vehicle, an armoured recovery vehicle, a heavy armoured personnel carrier, and several types of self-propelled gun, along with some others built on the same chassis. The concept of building a number of vehicle types on a common chassis is certainly not new, something both the Soviets and the NATO countries had done before, with the obvious advantages in manufacturing, training and logistics. The designation for this new series of vehicle was Prospective Family of Heavy Unified Battlefield Platforms, if you translate that from the Russian. So of that family, it's the T-14 Armata tank that interests us here. Much of the T-14 Armata tank lies in a previously cancelled T-95 project. This tank was finally abandoned in 2010. Although the T-14 is looked at as new, it actually relies on systems and ideas from some much earlier projects. The first step in designing this new tank was to have a turret that was unmanned. The smoothbore 2A82 1M 125mm cannon is an upgrade from the weapon on the T-90. Russian sources claim its muzzle energy is far greater compared to the Rheinmetall 120mm gun. There is no fume extractor as it's on an unmanned turret, so toxic fumes are not an issue. The fire rate of the 2A82 is allegedly to be from about 10 to 12 rounds per minute. A range of ammunition types is carried. The new Vacuum 1 armour-piercing, fin-stabilised discarding sabot round is fitted with a 90cm long rod penetrator. That's unusually long. It is said to be capable of penetrating 1 metre of rolled homogeneous armour at about 2,000 metre. The gun also fires anti-helicopter missiles. The next radical point was the engine. That long-developed V12 diesel engine has finally been abandoned. UVZ, Russia's main tank manufacturer, in a much-hyped action, took an engine called the A85-3 that was a copy of a German egg-shaped engine from the war years. The Transdiesel Design Bureau had originally offered the engine as a unit for compressor, oil and gas pumping stations. The A85-3 was not, however, a reliable product, and from all reports it seems to have had major issues. It's almost twice the power of a T-72 engine, it is attached to a 12-speed automatic gearbox, and it's claimed it's capable of reaching 80 to 90 kilometers per hour, or 50 to 56 miles an hour. And it has a range of 500 kilometers. The T-14 has new 70cm diameter road wheels and an electronically adjustable suspension system on at least the first 2 road wheels and possibly the last ones. And that's called an active suspension system, but is fitted over a main torsion bar suspension. It also has rubber-blocked tracks. And the next radical feature of the vehicle is the crew station. The crew is inside a cocoon, an air-conditioned capsule, and they're seated in a row for better communication. They have digital screens in front of them, with the commander scanning with using remote cameras in his main sight, which includes an infrared mode. The driver, he sees his frontal arc, and also via cameras, he can see around him. And the gunner can see his target, but he can also choose through those screens a relevant ammunition type. The chassis and turret are equipped with a malachite dual explosive reactive armour system, and on the front sides and the top there's stealth coatings. The active protection system has a radar to detect and track incoming anti-tank munitions. It states the maximum speed of incoming interceptable target is 1,700 meters a second, or Mach 5. It protects the tank from all sides, although the top of the vehicle is still vulnerable to top attack munitions. Russian sources claimed it's effective against depleted uranium core, APFS DS rounds up to 2 kilometers away, but Western analysts remain skeptical. The 5 hard-kill launcher tubes, 5 on each side, are sited between the turret's front sides and the chassis. The tank has a new type of lightweight armour that was developed by the Steel Scientific Research Institute. However, on closer inspection, a number of these technologies and features are not fitted to some of the vehicles. Some you can see there's covers where the technology or that piece of equipment should be. On others, it's fitted for, but not with. Prototypes of the vehicles were shown at the Russian Arms Expo in September 2013, and the first pre-production vehicles of each of the three branches, or the main types of vehicles that were going to be produced, were shown to the public at the 2015 Moscow Victory Day parade. A Russian Lieutenant General declared that the T-14 platform had used or reused many features from the abandoned T-95 tank prototypes. So the new T-14 tank is a radical departure in sense of its scale, its layout, its design features and technology from that era of evolutionary Soviet-designed vehicles. Originally intended to replace all Russian Army tanks, the Russian military had planned to acquire about 2,300 T-14s between 2015 and 2020, according to many press releases and military sources. But by 2018, delays were announced until at least 2025. Subsequently, announcements indicated the apparent cancellation of the main production run. The Deputy Minister of Defence said, quote, "There is currently no need to mass produce the Armata when its older predecessors, namely the latest variants of the T-72, remain effective against American, German and French counterparts." He went on, "Why flood our military with Armatas? The T-72s are in great demand on the markets." So why is this? The gradual tightening of sanctions, and then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the problem of sourcing the essential microelectronics has come to the fore. Russian industry has been critically dependent on foreign microelectronics and associated technologies. These are no longer available due to sanctions. The sites from France and other components are no longer available. No actual production line for the tank was established, and with serious losses of tanks in the fighting, Russian efforts have now gone into refurbishing or upgrading tanks that are already in service or storage. Other issues have come into play that affect the wider Russian defence industries. One is the perennial Russian problem of corruption. Since 2011, a staggering 72,000 officials have appeared before the courts on corruption charges. The mythic way many Russian military systems and products have been promoted and sold has met a crushing reality in Ukraine. The public exposure and promise made for the T-14 means even though there may only be 20 test vehicles available, there is an expectation they will make appearance in the battle. A British Ministry of Defence statement said, and I quote, "Any T-14 deployment is likely to be a high-risk decision for Russia. 11 years in development, the programme has been dogged with delays, reduction in planned fleet size, and reports of manufacturing problems. If Russia deploys the T-14, it will likely primarily be for propaganda purposes. Production is probably only in the low tens, while commanders are unlikely to trust the vehicle in combat." False claims have already been made about the deployment of the vehicles, but by the time this film is released, it may well be that the tank is in actual combat. Perhaps any tank aid to the beleaguered and hard-pushed Russian army will be used, whatever the risks involved. Looking at the wider picture, T-14 was a radical attempt to change the evolutionary process that was a tendency of Soviet and then later Russian tank design. Don't forget here, we are talking of the biggest tank manufacturing nation of all time. So will all the effort for the T-14 tank be a dead end? Or will those technologies be morphed into other projects? Or will a new version of T-14 be made for the export market? One thing we know for certain at the moment is for the Russian military, just getting any tank onto the battlefield is problematic.